Hi, how are you?
Hello, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks for hosting me, Kate.
Yeah,
Very lovely.
thanks for joining us. I just was showing your book, and I read this and read it again and again, and I earmarked pages and I highlighted things, and I'm so excited to reference it again and again. So thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, I'm just so excited to chat more about this book. So I'm going to start us off with the question, what does disruption mean to you?
Disruption for me is challenging the status quo, the way things are normally done, in such a way that it forces a reevaluation. And it's that reevaluation that I think is incredibly important to being an effective disruptor. So, for example, with the Sweetness of Venus, a history of the clitoris, one of the things I wanted to disrupt was the status quo that allows female sexual desire, pleasure, and words like the clitoris to be taboo. In another life, I was a high school English teacher, and I taught in a class. I had a class of 16-year-olds, and we taught for a year in a classroom, and on the back of every single chair was a graffiti penis. And if you I mean, you can imagine it.
Of
And if
course.
you flicked through, Macbeth of Mice and Men, it was there in the margins. And I remember once kind of saying to the girls in the class, I'm really sorry you have to face this all day. And then rather flippantly saying, maybe we should put it right and draw a few vulva just to kind of equal things up a bit. And the boys were outraged. You can't do that, miss. It's not allowed. They were appalled. But actually, when you think about it, we couldn't have drawn a clitoris because we didn't know. I'm wearing a
I
clitoris. Yeah.
I love that.
the we didn't even know what a clitoris looks like in terms of graffiti. And that's pretty shocking when it's so important to female desire and pleasure. So yes, with this book I wanted to be disrupted, and I wanted to interject the clitoris into the world in a way that it forced a reevaluation of the idea that anything to do with female sexuality was not allowed or indecent in some way.
Taboo. Yeah, I'm thinking about it and I'm like, how would you even draw a clitoris? How would you even draw that on? Because, as you find out in the book, it was not that long ago that, the world got a picture of what the clitoris actually looks like.
I would say it was imaged live 3D in 2005 by Dr. Helen O'Connell, and the press coverage at the time heralded it as new. But in fact, science, the full anatomy was known in 1844. And since then, there has been no excuse for in any biology or sex ed book for not drawing it in its glorious full structure. And
Proper.
yet, if you're lucky if it gets in, and then it's a dot.
Yeah, if it's even spoken about at all.
Yeah,
That blew my mind, that 3D printing in 2000, it was 2008.
it was 2005 that
2005. That
she
blew
did.
I
No,
actually verbally yelled, like I exclaimed when I read that. I couldn't believe it.
yeah, the 2005 actually was the 3D imaging live in a scanner.
Okay.
But the 3D printing, I don't know, maybe 2008. But yeah,
Crazy,
glorious.
crazy.
Let's have more of them.
Um, would you have considered yourself a disruptor before you wrote this book?
Do you know, I love this question because I really had to think about it. It was interesting for me because before this book I would have said no. My instinct is to abide by the rules. My default setting is not to go against them. Although I would always have said I was a critical thinker and not afraid to ask questions if I didn't understand the rules. Um, Although people increasingly say you're very outspoken, aren't you? So your question made me reevaluate whether I was a disruptor or not. And I think having written this book, I'm going to wear the disruptive badge with pride.
Hell
So
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. So now when you reflect back on it, would you say well, first of all, two things. You said you question. Is that disruption to you? Questioning?
No, because I think it's the forcing a reevaluation.
Yeah.
And I suppose with this book, there are a number of things that I'm asking people to reevaluate. It's not, I'm asking people to change how we understand, talk, and think about female sexual desire and pleasure on a number of different levels.
Yeah.
And I think people come away from this book having been anxious initially about the title, using the word clitoris with much more ease, and I think questioning a lot of the kind of unspoken, latent attitudes to female sexuality around us. And so I think that is disruptive.
Yeah. Yes. So tell me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think so. I mean, you tell me, can I wear the badge?
I think, yes, I absolutely. So that leads beautifully into my next question, which I actually thought about, should I ask you this first? But I think it ties so deeply into disruption. What was the inspiration behind writing, like even just the title and the topic? What is the story behind it?
I suppose the place to start is I had always wanted to write a book, and I was looking for a non-fiction idea that certainly I'd always been interested in gender studies and women's issues, so I knew that I was looking for an idea in that field. And I had thought about maybe writing about depression, mental health, about motherhood, and then the trigger for the idea to focus on female sexuality through the lens of the clitoris came from two conversations that I had within 1 week. And the first was with a young friend who said, how does sex really work? And she said, of course I know how it works, but I don't think I'm doing it right. It's nice enough, but sometimes I'd choose chocolate. And so then we talked about it, but I then realized that I had just assumed that people were better informed than I had been. But when you think about sex ed and what's available with porn, and that although it is now so widely available, so much of the free porn is still through a male gaze, and still shows intercourse as the ultimate orgasmic experience, which is not true for 75% of women. And when I discovered that statistic, 75%.
It's massive.
I then thought, wow, this is important. Why didn't I know this? Why isn't it normalized that actually the construction of sex that we have is not orgasmically as wonderful for women as it is for men? And then the second conversation I had was with a girlfriend who'd got much younger children than me, and she was saying, what language did I use? What language should she use for her daughter's anatomy? And we started talking about why vagina became the byword for the vulva, and that the vulva was a much more useful word because you were then able to cite within it vagina, clitoris, and labia, but that actually the discomfort around those words, and that made me think back to that episode in the classroom, and those two conversations triggered my desire to go back into my default, which is reading and research and history, to say, why is it that in 2021 I'm having these conversations, and why is it when I consider myself, engaged, interested, reasonably well read, that I am discovering things about the anatomy of the clitoris that I didn't know.
I have experienced that as well. I mean, and in reading your book I thought that I was relatively well informed as well, but in the first chapter of reading it, I couldn't believe the content. Every single page, the information was just mind-blowing, the history. And yeah, I mean, it explains a lot about, people's shame around, or women's shame around their own sexuality, because it really has been a shameful, you know, shrouded in a shameful sort of cloud for so long.
I think that's why it was important for me with this book, not only to look at the history of the anatomy, but to also then look at how religion and philosophy and psychology had intersected with that to create, whether they had colluded together, but certainly there was an intersection that meant narratives about how women's bodies worked was able to continue. And even when anatomy became unquestionable, culture had by that time taken up the script that inculcated this sense of taboo around female desire and pleasure and shame.
Yeah. And demonization of it, really. That's what it felt like, a real condemnation of, you know, anything to do with that. Did you come across any roadblocks or challenges in particular when you were researching and putting it together?
The very early one, when I had the idea and I talked to a couple of people in publishing, was that people were saying, well, is there enough material for a book? And and I knew, because I'd started doing the research, that there was, but I thought, well, that's a very easy one to put to bed, because I can, number one, I can kind of do the research and write the book, and then that won't be up for debate. But also I haven't written a book before, and it would also enable me to prove that I was the person to write this book. So I put that to the side and just thought, I'm going to go and do this because I'm fascinated. I think it matters, and I want to know the answer to these questions that I have about female sexuality, and I want to know whether I can write a book. I got very lucky in terms of finding an agent, but she and I both found the biggest challenge to selling the book to a publisher was still the taboo nature of, and the general lack of understanding about the importance of the clitoris to women. And that was a real roadblock. She said, I've never had rejections like it, Sarah. This is business, and mostly people come back to me and say, no, it wasn't for me. But she said, with your book, I'm getting notes from people saying, the author's voice was so fresh. We really enjoyed reading the proposal. It was fascinating. We learned so much, but we think the topic's niche. And I remember laughing, saying, niche. 50% of the world have one. 40% of the others, 40% maybe want to engage or should be engaging with one. And the other 10% will be carers to people with vulvas or supporting friends, family, children who are clitoris owners. And you know, it's not some minor BDSM kink. It's, you know, how is it niche?
Yeah.
So, and then the other roadblock we had is that publishers would come back and say, oh, we did a period book last year, or we did a menopause book. As if that negated the need for a book.
We've done one woman focused book already this year.
Tick box, you know, women's issues are covered. And that kind of just resistance and anxiety about publishing a book about female sexual desire and pleasure.
Did it piss you off?
It frustrated me. I was incredibly grateful that I had an agent who was committed and who didn't give up on it. Did it piss me off? I think because I hadn't published a book before, I didn't know how much was resistance to me as a new writer, and how much was resistant to the topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what kept you going? Was it your agent?
What kept me going was the fact that when I spoke to women about the idea, they warmed up to it so quickly. They wanted to talk about it. Even women that initially were kind of like, clitoris, would often come back and want to engage in a conversation, or seek me out later in the evening, or phone me up and have me out for a coffee. And I was enjoying doing the research and the writing. I couldn't believe that it hadn't been done before, and it felt so relevant to the world right now that's what kept me going. And once I realized it hadn't been done, and there are some fabulous academic books out there and some really amazing how-to books that talk about the clitoris, but the fact that I felt that by unraveling the history, you empowered people to sort of say, bogus. That is, I now understand why I am bound up in anxiety and a sense of taboo and shame, and that having it was empowering. And I kept going because I also had that sense of, okay, it hasn't been done before, and if not me, then who? And now is your moment to step up and prove to yourself that you can do this because you believe this matters.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that it was your first book, you'd never written one before, and you chose a topic that you knew was going to be no one had done before, and that you were going to get pushback. And it is so the epitome of a disruptor to me, because you went for it. And, I think a lot of people would second guess and question and stop and how many, and even people who are out there, I talk about all the things, but even saying vulva and clitoris, and depending on who you're with, you're kind of like, but we have no problem saying penis, and like it's everywhere. And it's just I love that you push through. And I asked you this before, what shocked and surprised you the most about the research you came upon writing this book?
Can I just go back? Because I would say one of the other things that kept me going was the Instagram community and the bookstagrammers, the sex positive educators, and actually finding that community also enabled me to push through, in that I realized I wasn't the only person who thought this mattered, that actually there was a community of people like you who, if I got to this point, wanted to engage and talk about it, and that it was a community that was also cheerleading for each other. It wasn't sniping, it wasn't competitive. It had a real sense of a shared mission. So that, that was important.
I find that as well too. And I think it's an interesting world in social media, because I think, that doesn't have that competitiveness, like you said, and people do support. And it's like, it's a forum for people to get the message out in a different way that doesn't pit you against each other based on, traditional things that in particular women get, pitted against each other. So I love that you say that, because that's an interesting point as well. So yeah, what shocked and surprised you the most about the research you came upon writing this book? Because I like I said, every page I turned, I made a noise, because I was just like, this is infuriating and insane.
As you say, there are many things. I was incredibly shocked by the extent to which science and Western culture had suppressed both knowledge of the actual anatomy of the clitoris, but also the function of the clitoris in terms of providing pleasure and desire. But second, that kind of following quickly behind this was this long-standing antipathy to female sexual pleasure and desire, and I was shocked by both of those. The fact that the clitoris was discovered and then lost so many times, that actually, how can you lose a body part? This is not a child with their lunchbox or their gym kit or even a set of keys. And I suppose against the way that women's voices about their sexual experiences, how those were also silenced by what was the mainstream academic thought at the time. So I was also shocked, actually, that in my research, I found that in the 16th and early 17th century, female pleasure in the kind of the equivalent to the tabloid press, not in the academic circles, but in kind of the cheap pamphlets being published, there was an emphasis on female satisfaction and joy in the creative act. But the way that in the 18th and 19th centuries that thinkers came in to close that down so effectively, to really erase it, was one of the things that shocked me the most, because it was visceral and vicious and systematic.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that it was repressed through erasure in the text, through laws about what could and couldn't be printed, through the labeling of women as sort of promiscuous, lusty, and dangerous if they were sexual. So
and the fact that there was that sort of tangible fear that if women knew that they could, have this pleasure, what might happen, they would just run the streets amok. Like, it was sort of like, that it almost made women into, really just an animal who can't be trusted in a way with this sort of powerful information that they have. That was crazy to me.
Well, crazy, and also kind of so ironic. I kept wondering whether there was some kind of inverse psychology there. Here were men who, when you look back through history, were as equally promiscuous, desirous, lusty as and given license in a way that women were not, and yet they were so quick to close women's pleasure down.
Yeah. And I wanted to add too, so there's so much in your book that is research based and so interesting, but I love that you have a very cheeky, sarcastic way about you, and I can hear your voice sort of putting in little funny jabs, and I really enjoyed that, because it didn't feel so much like a research educational textbook as it did just like sort of, I'm sitting next to you and you turn and say, can you fucking believe this? Like, just here's some information, and then I can't, and it felt very relatable. Like, okay, this is crazy and this needs to get out to people, which is, I find it so interesting that publishers are calling it niche. It's very wild. So what's changed for you since the book has come out?
Well, I love being able to talk to people about the book and hear what they think of it. I was very conscious of my readers as I wrote. In another life, I also worked in advertising. And I had a very strong sense that I believed it was a good idea. I knew that I was passionate about it, but I had done my research and felt that it was relevant to women, that there was an audience out there. And as I wrote, I kept thinking about the women and the men, the readers that I would have, and would they find this interesting? Would they find this funny? Was this going to work for them? And now having the opportunity to talk to people about that is fabulous.
Seeing that it really did resonate. I feel like it should be handed out to every young girl and boy coming of age, just like almost like a mandatory text that could open up so much for young people.
Well, and I think it was also very important to me that actually it was an inclusive book, and that actually you'll notice that when I talk about, historically, the science talked about men and women, but actually I intentionally talked about vulva owners and clitoris owners later on, because I think although this is the story of women's sexuality, that whole discussion about how we frame what is the defining sex act, how do we frame and talk about sexuality, and the opportunity to inhabit one's sexuality with ease and confidence is important to everybody, irrespective of how they receive pleasure. And I felt that was ultimately an important message from the book.
I agree. I think too, for men as well, to have an understanding of what the history is there and how they can play a part in normalizing this conversation as well. It's not just for women.
I didn't want to bash men, because I really believe that heterosexual men want their partners to have as much fun as they're having,
Yeah.
and that they have been shortchanged by sex
Yeah.
ed and science as well. And I didn't want to be making the crass, obvious jokes about it.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be a book that really just was cheerleading for pleasure. And I love the fact that you said that, you know, you enjoyed the ironic tone of voice and the humor, because I did want it to be a book that people enjoyed reading. I wanted it to be entertainment and not to feel like a heavy textbook.
Yeah. And you definitely accomplished that for sure. So what is something that not many people would know about you?
Do you know what? This was a difficult question for me too, because I don't have any secrets. I'm incredibly open. This question reminded me when my youngest son was 10. He was asked in class one day, they were all asked to write down 3 adjectives to describe their mothers. And I said, oh, what did you put? and he said, feminist and kind. I could only think of 2. And I thought about that, and I was so proud. I thought, wow, 2, that's fine. If those are the things that define me, then that's great. And I think if you read the book, you would know I was a feminist, and hopefully you would know that I am kind. But, you know, I'm straightforward. Ask me anything. I've got no guilty secrets or secret pleasures, which I guess is why I was able to write about the clitoris so openly, because there isn't a lot that's
I love that. I love that he was 10 and he said feminist and kind. That is adorable. Somebody is asking, Susan is asking, what will your next book be about?
Oh, wow. I've got a few ideas that I'm working around at the moment. I like the format. I loved doing the research, and it will definitely be a history book. And I loved connecting different aspects of culture, sort of what do we see represented in literature, art, the language around us, as well as kind of the academic basis for a topic.
I loved how you did that in this book as well. There was a combination of art and literature and education. I love that you just reminded me of that, the sort of cross section of, you know, and I wrote down a few of the books that you put in there. Oh, I have to read this, because it's such a complete kind of view of the time when you look at the art and the literature and the education. I thought that was very cool.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It will definitely be about women and women's roles in society, and I'm trying to work out which angle to take next.
Cool. I'm very excited.
I love the fact she says that there might be another book.
I'm very excited. I can't wait. So lastly, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be a disruptor?
Read and research. Listen to other people. Listen to other people talk about the topic, and join related networks. I think you're most powerful when you're confident about what you want to throw in the air and why. And you need to understand a system completely to disrupt it effectively. Otherwise, you're just creating noise.
Oh,
and I think
I love that. Say that again. You need to understand.
You need to understand the system completely to disrupt it effectively. Otherwise, you're just creating noise.
Oh, I love that.
And I think if you go back to disruption about forcing a reevaluation, coming from a position of information, it's back to that classic, information is power. And I think it does empower you to disrupt.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I love that. We have a question. What's your favorite book, Sarah?
Oh, wow. My favorite book.
I know, isn't that a hard question? So hard.
So hard. So I've got lots of favorite books, actually, sex books. Peggy Orenstein, Girls and Sex, where she talks about the sexual landscape for teens today. If you have a preteen or a teen in your care, her book is phenomenal. I've just read Hamnet, which is a non-fiction book by O'Farrell, and just the language in that was so rich and evocative and took me to Tudor England, and as a non-fiction book that was a joy. My all-time favorite book is called Fugitive Pieces. It's incredibly
that is my favorite book.
And so it's
gosh.
a hard, but the layers in it, you can go, the way that it unravels back through history, but it's not an easy read. It's not a book that you have to focus on the language.
Oh, Sarah, Fugitive Pieces and Michael's is just a beautiful, wow. I knew we were kindred spirits in so many ways. I love that. So I'm going to link, I'll put in the post, the book recommendations that you had. And if people want to know more about you, where can they find you on social media?
So my social media page is at its its.personalgirls, and if you link it, and my DMs are open. I love meeting people. I love feedback, and I've done some really fabulous book clubs with the book. So if you have a group of readers and you want to do a Zoom book club, I love to hear your questions. Love to talk.
Cool. So basically someone could just reach out and say they have a group of people they want to do a book club with you, and you would do that with them?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Awesome. That's amazing. Thank you so much. What a pleasure. I can't wait to see what comes next.
Can we do a book club?
I would love it.
Seeing as we share,
I would love it. I'm in.
Then maybe we need a virtual book club.
I am in. All right. Well, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it for sure. Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And
thank you for joining. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Yeah.